Dr. Pravir, in our culture, it's a great honor for our audience to have you to introduce about who you are and the work that you do. Would you please do that first?
Yeah, surely. So essentially, the work that I'm primarily engaged in is around complex systems thinking.
Mm.
And so what that equates to is working with different organizations that are experiencing problems that usually, no matter what they try, they just keep happening again and again.
Mm.
So they're complex problems because usually when we try and solve a problem, we have a fixed approach. There's a linear approach to solving it. We think that if we fix X, then Y will get solved. So there's a pretty direct relationship in terms of how we tend to approach problems. But when you think about it from a systems thinking perspective, then any kind of problem that's occurring is the result of many, many different things that are happening. There's many different interconnections. So the work that we do and the work that I've been doing for a couple of decades is really focused around that. It's around helping organizations to rethink the way that they're solving problems that occur again and again. And these may be problems from inventory management, or there might be problems with safety if it's a manufacturing organization, or it might be problems of trying to go into a market in a particular way to gain market share, but you're always doing it in the same way. So it could be anything, because ultimately every aspect of an organization is subject to the system. It's whatever is happening is the result of the way a system is working. And so that's essentially what I do is the systems thinking around trying to reframe and resolve problems differently.
Wow. Thanks for sharing your past, like decades of work in just a few minutes. So allow me to bring you to different version of different time. Allow you and I to come back to time. Okay. So when I
Sure.
was young, I wanted to become an astronaut and wearing the astronaut suit and jumping in different planet, and it didn't happen. Okay, not even close. So, Dr. Pravir, when you was young, what was your dream about yourself, about the future self? Can you share with us?
Yeah, so that's very interesting because I had the same dream as you.
Ah, really?
So I wanted to be an astronaut as well.
Ah,
So I grew up in India, and when I grew up there, it was in the 60s and 70s. So it's a long time ago, and I didn't have, there was not a lot of television or anything, but I got exposed to, there was a couple of movies that were more oriented, were science fiction, were space oriented, and it had a very deep impact on me, and I wanted to then also be an astronaut. So that
ah,
was my very early aspiration. And it lasted for a long time until I pretty much, I would say I was about 14 or 15, and then things began to change. But up till then, that's what I had wanted to do.
wow. So from that 14 and 15, and something changed in there that leading to what you are doing today. Can you tell us about that change? What was that, and what did you do back then, though?
Well, so basically it was the reality of how can one go about becoming an astronaut, because I was in a third world country
Mm.
in which that wasn't an option. So if one wanted to do that, then one had to come to the US or USSR or a country like that, and that meant a completely different, basically a reorientation.
Mm.
But however, what I began to get interested in, because I realized that that wasn't a possibility, was something around controlling the different the space flight from
Mm.
remotely.
Mm.
And so I began to get interested in computer sciences and computer engineering, because again, the images had come from different movies I had seen where you had like a space control center on Earth, and that was instrumental in the way that the space flight was happening.
Mm.
And so then I began to reorient around becoming a computer engineer.
Mm.
And so that was and I did end up doing that because I then came to the US. I've been here since the 1980s, but I came here to study computer engineering, and I entered the field, computer science. I focused on artificial intelligence for a few years, and then there were different things that happened that changed that, but that was the initial focus.
Wow. So you came to the US in the 80s and studied computer science, get into the field for artificial intelligence for a few years, and something happened again that leading to we want to know what that something happened that leading to your decades of works around complex system thinking. Can you share further?
Yes, of course. So I began to work as a programmer for a company in Chicago. But then I realized that it was extremely difficult to make change happen. So I'm not talking about when you instruct a program and you write down a computer program, it works perfectly. But I'm talking about the organization where I worked, where things there were always plans that were made that were never fulfilled, and so that really got my curiosity. I said, why is it so complex to make change happen in organizations? And so I did an MBA in the early 90s in Chicago, and because I got very interested in this whole question. And to me, even though yes, I was an engineer and a computer scientist, that field seemed relatively simple compared with the dynamics of what actually occurs in organizations. After all, we may have a great plan, come up with a great idea to enter a market or to come up with a new product, but there's so many other things that come in the way to stop it. For example, like there's the human emotion, and there's different deep biases and assumptions that we have, that even if we see the data and we see that yes, a certain part or a path should be taken of action, yet it's not taken. And so that really got my curiosity. Why is it that in the face of even analysis, and even when it's pretty clear from the data that you should go a certain way, that yet it doesn't happen? And that's why I began to get very interested in the whole management aspect, and that led me deeply into systems thinking, but in a very organic way, because as I entered as a consultant into the workforce, and then I had opportunity to work with many different organizations in different parts of the world as a consultant. But still that kind of eluded me. So I came up with my own kind of brand of thinking. I wrote a series of, it started off with a simple article that looked at what I call fractal dynamics. Fractal dynamics. And so my question was very simple. It's, to what degree is it that human perception or human bias or human assumptions or behavior really influences, for example, the way a team operates, or the way a company operates, or the way that a company goes to market, or the way that the company thinks about the market. So to me, it was all very, very related. And so I came up with a theory, a fractal dynamics theory, where a certain very simple pattern repeats itself, and it creates the biases that exist in an organization as a whole. And so, up till that point, there was a lot of analysis done with fractals. So this was, right on the cutting edge of it. So it was in the late 90s, early 2000s is when I had begun to think about it. And the work that had been done in fractals was much more mathematical, was much more technical. It was in more scientific fields. There had been also some application to stock market, but there hadn't been much application to organizations. And so the paper that I wrote was for a journal, and then I was invited to write a 3-book series on fractals, which I started writing in the mid 2000s, and it didn't finish till about 2015. But that was my own particular way of thinking about systems, and so that's how I got very deeply embedded into it.
Wow. And you spent decades for this. And a lot of people will give up in a very very early, jump up the boats very early, and I'm having very a high admirations for the people that have the resilience to go against all of the boredoms, all of the challenges, to continually doing the job. And like in your case, you spend really really long years to deep dive into understand that, because of the curiosity back then when you work for organization, and you didn't understand why things didn't work in the order it's supposed to be working, right? So tell us, how did you give the strength to yourself, Dr. Pravir, so that you can persevere all of the challenges and continue doing this research though?
Well, so I think it was just something that arose because I had a passion around it.
Mm.
So it was like a burning question for me. It was not something that was just intellectual, but I deeply wanted to understand it in a different, in a visceral kind of way.
Mm.
And so that persistence, it just kind of continued. And the other thing that led to the continuation was because the more I began to study how an organizational system works,
Mm.
the question that I continued to ask myself was that what's an example, or where can I find a system that is truly very deeply resilient, and what are the characteristics of that?
Mm.
And so I was continually searching. So that led me into a research and trying to understand biological systems, trying to understand chemical systems, trying to understand physical systems, trying to understand the nature of light, from which in subsequent work that I've done, and I've written 14 books on what I call cosmology of light, but essentially it's looking at complex systems from a much more broad perspective, using physical, chemical, biological bases from which other kind of behavioral drives arise. And so the stuff that I've been involved in the last decade, it kind of fueled my interest, further and further, because the questions seem unending.
Mm.
No matter how much I researched, I wasn't satisfied. It just felt like there was more to understand, there was deeper to go. And so it just got reinforced because of the unknown that always stood in front of me. So that was kind of like the driving thing. If uh, hopefully that's clear, but that was what drove me. So
Because the curiosity will never stop, right? So if you find, you got curiosity in this aspect, and then when you research, you just realize there's more to this and more to this, and that keep expanding, expanding, expanding into the reach of your works. Your body of works also changing a lot through that also. So Dr. Praveen, the complex system thinking is something that is I never heard of that, like I shared with you earlier, and I want you to help sharing that, your research, your work about that to our audience, so that we can know more about complex system thinking. Can you share?
yeah, sure. So there's a few different ways to approach it, but let me start very practically. That if we think about what really is a system, and let's think about an organizational system. Usually, you could define that system as being consisting of many independent parts that are all interconnected, and in which there's no clear centralized control, because every part has its own kind of will to do things when it comes down to it. And so the question is, when you put together, or when all these different parts come together, like in a behavioral organizational system, then how is it going to operate? Because even though there is supposed to be a central direction, and there's supposed to be some goals and objectives, the reality is that when you really look at how organizations work, that's not always the case. And there's lots of different local tendencies, there's local objectives that take precedence over other objectives. And so the question is, when you bring together all these independent, the quote unquote independent parts, you connect them in a network because everything influences everything else. and yet they all have to operate as one entity to continue to achieve something so that they can all continue to exist, then that's what systems thinking is. Systems thinking is, how does this complex entity that's consisting of many different parts that operate independently, not necessarily driven by one goal, how does it all exist, and how can we begin to make sense of it and make it kind of move in the directions that we want it to move? So essentially that's how I would summarize it. Now, there's been a lot of work done around systems thinking, and I'll say that from MIT, there's been a very, very substantial foundation of work that's done that has informed also a lot of work that I'm doing. And I'm leaving aside for now the fractal dynamics side, which I'll come back to it, which was, my particular development in systems thinking. But if you think about, what MIT has done with systems thinking, they essentially take a system and they will see that, what kinds of flows exist. And there's some very simple flows that create loops. We can call them reinforcing loops and balancing loops. And then they look at the nature of these different loops. And then when they understand the nature, we can see that embedded in the system, there's, what's called archetypes. So there's patterns or these arrangements of loops that will create deep tendencies of how the system will work. And so if I go back to the original question or the original problem that I posed, that systems thinking is best employed where a problem occurs, the same problem occurs again and again and again. And no matter what you do, that problem still occurs. And so, here was a kind of approach to solving that, because we can see when we understand the different flows in a system and the different arrangement of loops, that there are things called archetypes, or there's certain kind of patterns that exist in the way these loops are, that will, no matter what you do, will always create the same output. And so the problem, will continue to occur. And so that's, one very fundamental way in which systems thinking is used. That's an easy way. It's easily learned. It's very systematic. It's a very scientific way to solve problems using systems thinking. And then if I bring in the whole aspect of the fractal dynamics, which is the thinking that I've pursued, is the issue around, essentially you're adding layers of complexity into the system, because the study of systems, or really the practical approach to systems thinking and problem solving, has been I'll say it's been a single layered approach where you work out all the different interconnections and the different loops that exist, but it's in one layer. Now, when you bring in the human psyche and human dynamics, then, if we just look at ourselves, we know that there's fundamentally a few different ways in which we might act. We may employ thought, which is a way of thinking, so that's an unbiased view based on facts. And if we come from there, then we're operating in a certain level. Or we may come from our emotion. And that completely defies logic, So ultimately, no matter what the data is, we will revert back to a feeling that we have and say, I don't feel good about this, or I feel good about this, I want to do this. And that becomes what kind of arbitrates a decision. But that's a completely different level of operation. So we're seeing there's this vertical axis, there's thought, there's emotion, and then there's kind of like, gut instinct, or there's something different where, we may, in spite of what everybody says, we still get the sense that, no, this is the right thing to do. And that's something very different. So the question is, when you marry this kind of vertical dimension onto the horizontal dimension of systems thinking as it exists, then you get a different kind of complexity way to think about systems. And that's really what fractal dynamics is about, because if we always tend to come to a decision using, for example, a sense of fear versus joy, which is a particular kind of dynamic at the emotional level, For example, we all know that the stock market tends to work that way.
Mm.
We'll continue to see a rise in stock prices. People have positive feelings, so there's kind of like a joy at making money. But then at some point, fear kicks in. And when fear kicks in, then there's a sellout, and then the stock market kind of crashes. But that's an emotional. That's layering emotional dynamics into the way a system operates.
Mm.
And so, we're saying the same thing happens in organizations, that decisions are not just made with the mind, which is the way it should be made, but there's other things that are influencing how decisions are made, and they create different kinds of patterns that exist. So, for example, if I have a boss who I know that if he or she gets triggered by a certain thing and they become very angry or they become very pleased, that's an emotional response. But that can influence how I navigate in the system. If I want something to happen, I can try and please my boss and make sure that they're in a good mood, and that the thing will go in a certain direction then. So that's how fractal dynamics kind of plays in to this idea of systems thinking. So it's kind of putting a vertical dimension on the horizontal analysis that's happening.
Wow. So it's like because there's a lot of things that influence the decision of an organization that coming in and altering the possible outcome of what we're gonna decide. So the fractal dynamic is something that you said that can come in between and help to steer the decision making process into to make sure that the emotion part is controlled, the logical part is also put into considerations, and all aspect of that has been fully understood. Am I correctly understand that?
Yes, correct. That's at the essence of it. Correct. Yes.
And then you see the like you say that years ago you had the burning curiosity about why people making decisions, and then organization making decision to change something, and the same issue, the same problem happen again and again, the same result happen again and again and again, and through and even now like I do see the complexity of that happening again and again and again, because like for example, in my line of work, many leaders across industries, across countries, want to create better teams, right? Better, create a gel between the team. But the silo organizations there, and it's not fixing, and even they try to break the silos, it's not working. So the same issue of team incoherent, the same issue with the dysfunctional of the teams as a whole still existing. If we come to the complex system thinking with the fractal dynamics to have it, can it come and have fixing the issue?
Yeah. Yes. It definitely does. So, but however, because what happens when you do that, you make it very clear. You make the whole dynamics very clear, and then if the organization does want to move in a certain direction, so assume that it wants to increase revenues or profitability by a certain percentage, and you can show that the system as it functions will never allow you to do that. It may allow you to do it for 1 or 2 years, but it will bite you back later, because you compromise something to achieve those short-term goals, and that thing is going to come back, because it's always part of the system, unless you addressed it from the system's point of view, to really truly see the interconnection that needs to exist between the different silos, to change the decision making that happens within the silos, so that there can be more of a shared approach. Unless stuff like that happens, it's always going to circle around the same possible outcomes, and the same kind of goals, the same objectives. No matter how much you try to change them, you'll always get the same kind of result, which you've gotten, because you haven't really addressed the core issue, which is that the system hasn't changed. And so how can you expect your results to change unless you change the system. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So, it's not an easy paradigm, or it's not an easy sell to make to an organization to adopt systems thinking. But those organizations that have truly benefited from it, and that's essentially what can be used to drive the decision making is when you show the extraordinary results that you've achieved because of this approach. Then other companies that are resistant, may be more willing to adopt it. But as you know, it's easier done if there's some kind of buy-in from the top of the organization. So especially if you're beginning to do systems thinking, you need then essentially to work with all the different parts of the organization to make that change happen. And so there needs to be some high-level buy-in that, yes, this is an approach that's worthwhile.
We're gonna bring to the top end commitment in the later time of this conversation. I wanna focus to the now for that one, because if you say that the system thinking will help us to see to fix a problem and build a sustainable long-term results, right? And we tend to see the present results as something that that tell us whether or not we're going to the right direction, to the wrong direction and stuff. It's gonna be extremely hard if the current result shows really positive. For example, if a boss makes some changes to the route to market and the product is really good, but if we look at if we understand the system thinking concept, then we see that result is just it's not sustainable in the future.
Yes.
But just so how can we come and intervene and have, hey boss, this is only work for now, but if you continue doing that, we're gonna go down the hill in the future because we not put everything into considerations. And so how can we change the people in that winning mindset, to see the bigger picture of the whole, Dr. Pravir?
Yes, that's never an easy. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. That's the reality of it. And so, as a consultant, one thing that I learned is that if the client isn't willing to go in a certain direction, it's not worth it. So no matter what you suggest, but there has to be a willingness to begin to move in a certain direction that's different than what's going on currently, and it becomes much more worthwhile if that willingness exists. So if as a consultant, if I come into an organization and you're working, or I'm working with it's going to, the change is only going to happen if one can work at the executive level. But that means there has to be buy-in from the top, and then usually if that buy-in exists, then it's much easier to make the change across the organization. But the fundamental issue is the buy-in itself. Now, in terms of the analytics, it's very easy to show somebody who's willing to see that a short-term action that might be creating advantages due to, say, changes in some product or a new product that's been introduced into the market is going to last only for a certain amount of time, because there's lots of connections that need to be sustained in order for that product to kind of continue to yield the results that it has. But many times a product decision is made without considering the other interconnections that need to be also managed at the same time. So systems thinking, when you really focus on all those interconnections and the nature of the loops, and how something that you're doing right now that might only activate is only using some of those loops, but in reality there's other loops that are continuing to have flow in them, but they're being kind of marginalized, they're going to kick back. They're going to create all kinds of weaknesses in the foundation that will show up in different kinds of ways if they're not addressed. I mean, you can make the case and you can show that from an analytical perspective. And when you show it from an analytical perspective, that might get the kind of buy-in that you need. But it does require some investment in order to show how actions taken are only employing certain categories or certain kinds of loops, but all the other loops continue to exist, but they're operating of their own accord. They're not really part of the system that you need to work with as a whole in order to ensure that you are sustainably doing what you're doing. And that so it becomes a question of a person being willing and open to see that kind of analytical framework.
And that led me to one of the things that we've been debating a long time in this part of the world, because with my understanding about what you're sharing, so I assume that at the headquarters, the big boss, the CEO is always trying to create a loop that build everything in from within, like the sustainability, the cultures, and how to grow the employees, the partners, and everything's very, very nice way. And then that loops go into the regional, go into the local, like country level. Then the same loop, but then in each each part of the chain, then the loops transform into different kind of loops, right? And leading by different kind of leaders with different kind of agendas, and the tendency that we try to solve here in this part of the world is because of a lot of leaders coming on the short-term assignments. And because they're on a short-term assignment, they create their own loops. As long as they deliver the number, as long as they deliver a certain, KPIs, and then they're gonna move into the next country, leading the next project, the different teams, and those loops, create a lot of, um, different result. Again, some can be supporting for the big loops of the organization, but some is not going to create a sustainable for that particular country they're leading, because the agenda was trying to perform, then go to the next. And how do you think that how do we help leaders at the top organization to change the notion of moving people around too much too quick like that, so that it's not enough time for them to bring something sustainably into the foundations.
Yeah, it's that's again a tricky, very very tricky question, because it's the way it's been done for decades, and there's a particular way in which leaders are moved around from the top, from one area to the other, and there's a bias, and oftentimes the success that's attributed to a market is solely the leader. It comes down to people perceive that it's due to the way the leader comes in and makes change. In reality, if you want to create a sustainable system, then there's lots of different things that need to happen, and a leader, by coming in and doing things that they did in one country in another country, or in one region in another region, aren't really working with the whole system, and that is a short-term thing. Because what I mean to say is that unless they change how they're operating to truly understand what's happening, for example, in Vietnam or in San Francisco, if the company is to come here, then unless they totally understand how the system is working locally, they can't make change that is truly going to be sustainable. It may have the short-term result that they're used to because they do certain things, but I would argue that the overall system becomes weaker as a result. It's not becoming stronger. You may have the short-term thing, but it's not going to be able to continue year after year.
The worst thing about that is recently I read a research about the life cycle of CEOs. The life
Mhm.
cycle of CEO in one organization actually getting a lot shorter than normally it is. So it means that you know you were a CEO for a company, you have a vision of the company, and you want to create a long-term sustainability for and that because it's a long term, but then long term, then my tenure here is ended in about 3 to 5 years, and then that is the time that a CEO has for a role, right? Another one coming in, and whether or not the new person would like to continue the legacy, or he or she would create a new like vision of long-term sustainability. So that's whole loop of changing on top create a lot of bigger loop, like confusions and challenges for the the loop underneath of them to see. And Dr. Pravir, I always believe in the power of our consumers. The consumer is the one that the consumer was very easy a long time ago for years, but the complexity
Mhm.
of consumer market now requires a lot of change from the leadership style, from the company values and mission and passions, and that complexity will also increasing in the coming years, and that leading to the sustainability, the equation, another piece that's very hard to predict. And leadership has to change a lot also, organization has to change a lot also. So in your in your view, what do you see this gonna come in the coming years though?
You mean the leadership change?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think the trend that you pointed out is, of course, a little disturbing because if the tenure of CEO becomes shorter and shorter,
Mm,
then you essentially are spinning a system out of control.
mm,
That's essentially what it comes down to. Especially if, as the tenure gets shorter, there's not an adequate understanding or incarnation, I'll call it incarnation, of the way that that CEO thinks
oh,
to the realities of how the system is thinking. And so, unless there's this kind of change in leadership, it's going to be difficult for um, markets, regions to move in the direction of sustainable growth. Now, you pointed out something else, the power of consumer. I'll say that there's a power in market, there's a power that's beyond
mm,
the organization, or a small business organization. And that power, which also, depending on how we look at a system, we can say that an organization is part of a much larger system.
mm,
And to the degree that an organization is able to allow, say, a market to continue to grow, then that organization it will be favored by the market,
mm,
right? But that means that there has to be a completely different understanding. And so, leaders, to your question, or around the kind of leaders that are needed, you need kind of a level of authenticity, a level of humility, where the leader can recognize that a market, or there's a demand, or there's something different that is required.
mm,
And the question is, how can the assets of the company, how can all its loops, essentially reinforcing balancing loops, how its different archetypes, how can those all be changed to address this question of where the market itself is going? And to the degree that you have leaders who are humble enough to begin to see that there's something larger that kind of calls and pulls things in a certain direction,
mm,
then things can go in a different way. But if that doesn't happen, if you continue to have like your very strong personalities, A type, who believe that they always have the answer and want to do things in a certain way, then essentially you're creating larger and larger problems.
mm,
And so the tenures will become even shorter and shorter, because then when that CEO is trying something and a year later nothing's happening, then the board of directors is going to want to get a different CEO in, and so it's not going to help the trend at all. So it requires a shift, a truly different kind of shift where you have the kind of leader who's arising, who is in touch with things outside of themselves in a very different way. So they're not just driven by an ego sense, but there's truly kind of a humility that makes them, in a sense, one with the requirement of what needs to be done. And so unless that can happen, you don't really have the beginnings of a sustainable system in place.
Got it. Dr. Pravir, I have two last questions for this conversation today. All right.
Yeah.
And the first question is about thinking. And again, you've been working on like complex system thinking. You've been working on a lot of other big project. And my wife and I have been on the quest to help people to think better, because we believe deeply from our hearts that our ability to think these days is not increasing but decreasing. And every chance that we got an opportunity to talk to an expert like you are, we will ask this question: how have you been helping yourself to expand your ability to think?
Yeah. So definitely there's a fair amount of introspective practices that I've employed for myself, and that I also recommend to others, because it's very easy to begin to play into a system that you become a part of. So the thoughts of the system can become your thoughts. The biases of the system can become your biases. Habits or what's been done in the past can become your habits and what you tend to do in the future. Unless there's again, I come back to this word or authenticity, or there's kind of a deeper sense or revelation of as an individual, what it is that you stand for and who you are, and what dynamics you can bring that are different, because there's a system, within us. There's a flow of thoughts, there's a flow of emotions, there's a flow of sensations, but there's also something that stands behind it, that is, what defines uniqueness or individuality. And to the degree that we can enter into contact with that deeper part in ourselves, that part that's not necessarily tossed so easily when things around us change, if we can enter into a relationship with that part that each of us has, then we can truly think differently, because we're not then just succumbing to trends and things that might be happening without adequate thought around us. And so that becomes very important. So the question is, what kind of practices can increase thinking? It's very simple things, So if we think about our mental processing capabilities, or our processing capabilities as an individual, in many respects, there's obviously finite processing capabilities. We shut off things when they become too complex, and we give a rationale to why things are happening, because we don't have the capacity to think about it deeply enough. If we free up some of the capacity that normally occupies us, so for example, when emotions arise, rather than being seized by an emotion, whether it's anger or frustration or fear, we kind of step back from it. Then we're freeing up processing capability within ourselves. And when we free up processing capability, then we are able to begin to see something freshly and to begin to address it in a different way. And that's really how thinking can change. It's when we take the time to get in touch with something deeper in ourselves that frees up this normal kind of way in which we process stuff. And because we free that up, we now use that processing capability differently, and we all have vast amount of processing capability that can be used differently.
Wow. Thanks a lot for sharing that, because a lot of us let life carry us on. So we give our capacity to those forces that drive us, right? And then because of that, we don't have the space and our additional capacity for doing something differently, and have, and think differently. So thanks for sharing that, Dr. Pravir. I will ask you the last question, and this is again about you. So we understand when you were young, you want to be an astronaut like I was, right? And then by the 14 years old, you realize something differently, and then you got into the computer science. You work your way up in the corporate ladders. Then you realize the curiosity on why things not working out the way it's supposed to be working out, and then you're dedicating your decades of times onto complex system thinkings and a lot of other amazing things. Now we want to head into the future a little bit. Okay, is there anything that Dr. Pravir is working on that you're happy and you're excited you want to share with us, and we can celebrate with you in advance?
Sure, sure. Yeah, so of course, the systems thinking has had a huge impact on the way I see things. And as I shared earlier, the kind of investigation that I began with, what is it that is a truly resilient system, or where does this power of adaptability and the power of complexity come from in a well operating system? And that kind of, as I said, led me into a search for what drives resilience in biological systems, chemical systems, physical systems, light. And then going back to a full circle as I began to study light and began to look at it from the perspective of a system, because again, I'm thinking about all these different layers and how light is responsible for many different dynamics. That's led me into a different kind of thinking about computation. So as I think about a project that I'm working on right now that I'm happy to share is around quantum computation. And essentially, it's employing the systems thinking to begin to think about computation differently. Because today there's massive investment, billions of dollars that are being made in the fields of quantum computation. So there's hardware that's being developed, there's software that's being developed. But if you look at the kind of origins of the thinking of quantum computation, it's very, very linear. It's essentially comes down to something called the Copenhagen interpretation and a particular view of how the quantum level works. And I've approached that whole computation differently. And a lot of the research and a lot of technical articles that I've written have to do with applying systems thinking to this quantum computation. The reason why I bring this up is that systems thinking can pretty much be applied everywhere, to massively change even how something as fundamental as computation occurs, or how we can think about that. And one thing that I will leave as an aspiration that I have for myself. So I filed a patent for a different kind of quantum computer, and at the moment I'm in the process of trying to raise funds to create something that's different than an IBM or a Google is creating, that essentially is based on this systems framework to arrive at how computation can be thought of differently. So that's, again, it's just pointing to the power of systems thinking, and there's no limits to where it can be applied.
And there's also no limits in where you can think and do also. So Dr. Pravir, I thank you for the opportunity to knowing you and having you to the show. And I really admire all the work that you do, your continual of expanding the research, expanding the area of interest onto to make to um, to to solve the curiosity and then try to go against and try to find different answers from what the works of the people already been doing. And perhaps that is the way, if everybody go into the same directions, there needs to be somebody like you to try to see things in the different perspective. And that might solve the issue, that might create something more exciting for many people to join. So I wish you well. I wish you have all the support that you need. I wish you we find the result that you are searching for. And along the way, let me know how's the progress and everything. All right.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for reaching out, and very nice to connect and speak with you. It's been a pleasure to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a wonderful evening. Okay.
Thank you.
Say hello to your family for us also, please.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.